So Terry, it's an honor to sit with you and be able to dialogue with you. You're a man of many hats. You're a philosopher, author, activist, entrepreneur, consultant, and coach. And the main reason we're here today is to talk about your new book, your groundbreaking book, A New Republic of the Heart, an ethos for revolutionaries. An ambitious title, but we're really going to dig in. But before we start talking and digging into it, I'm just curious about your own personal journey to where you are now and what stimulated writing the book.
You know, it's interesting. Writing the book has brought me back to my roots. When I was 6, my parents moved from the south side of Chicago to a place called the York Center Community Co-op, and it had been founded by members of the local Church of the Brethren, which is one of the peace churches. And they wanted to do something like an intentional community with cooperative ownership structure. So they bought a 70-acre cornfield and began building their own homes and invited people of other religions and other races to live together with them as a witness for peace and brotherhood. And so it was an interracial, interreligious community back when that wasn't even being done. It started in the 40s. And there was some hostility from the outside community. While our house was under construction, one of the neighbors' front yards had a cross burned on it. So, you know, we did encounter the racism of the outer community a bit. But what was really important for me about it was that as I grew up in the Vietnam War years, I was kind of mentored by my friends' parents and my parents' friends who were pacifists and civil rights leaders and, you know, Japanese Americans who'd been in the internment camps in a whole disposition of a spiritually based social stand. And so I was kind of an activist right out of the womb. I was kind of a red diaper baby, as they sometimes are called. But then in college, leading and participating in various demonstrations right at the peak of that era in 1969, 1970, I had some pretty striking experiences that made me realize that if I was to be a presence of not just peace, but a presence of wisdom and love in a meaningful way, I had to be transformed. And that drew me to the human potential movement and then ultimately to the ashram where I spent the first half of my adult life. And I've really been deeply involved with consciousness technology, with the integral movement since then. And I've also been trying to pay attention to what's happening in the world, what time it is on the planet. And in these last years, it has become apparent to me that we're all receiving our draft notice, our conscription orders by the great orchestrator of all things, and being asked to integrate our inner work with the outer work. It's no longer valid to just be pursuing your own awakening or your own enlightenment. And it has to find expression that makes a difference in the world. But the people who are activists definitely need to embody a higher wisdom too. So we're finding that we need each other, and a kind of a different level of awakening, a different level of love in action is being asked of us, and I think is both possible and necessary. And so this book comes out of that awareness.
Yeah. So it sounds like the book is an outgrowth of a lifelong of growth, education, thought.
Definitely.
Kind of an organic expression.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And there's a recognition, I think, that we're in a moment in which that archetype of the revolutionary has new relevance. You know, the old, you know, like the Che Guevara posters or the Black Panther posters that were popular when I was an adolescent. You know, there's a kind of edge of violence, you know, that kind of edgy, dark energy. And even the word activist, you know, almost has a angry or kind of, there's a quality of negativity associated with it. And we're going to have to find a way to be revolutionaries of love, really, real presence, a profound presence of wisdom and love at a different level, and a kind of love that is even more powerfully authoritative and, you know, that can outflank anger, Instead of being overpowered by anger, our qualities of love are going to have to speak with authority of a different kind.
So before we go right into the book, The New Republic of the Heart, I'm just curious to know who are some of the people that have inspired you and helped you with that light bulb that has gone off in your head many times.
And there are so many people who've been a huge part of my journey. You know, my work has been most associated with the integral community, so my friends in that community, Ken Wilber, Steve McIntosh, Jeff Salzman, Diane Hamilton, been dear companions throughout this. But I've moved over to other territories. Andrew Harvey's been an enormously important thinking partner. Joanna Macy is probably the mentor I feel most reverently close to. She's been huge for me. Jean Houston. Women are really important in this time, and the kind of leadership that we need, it comes from men who have a more highly developed inner feminine as well as women, and in a kind of partnership. I call it a brother-sisterhood. So those are, you know, and there are countless names of dear friends that I'm not thinking to mention right now, but this book was written by, you know, it takes a village, you know.
So I'll just skip ahead a few steps because you mentioned women. You do talk in your book about like yin power, or just that power of the yin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yin heroism is the phrase. Because the kind of heroism that we need is of a different character, because only a community is sufficient for this moment. You know, Thich Nhat Hanh so famously said, the next Buddha may very well be a Sangha. Well, we're facing existential challenges to our the whole future of human civilization. The seriousness of the climate crisis, the seriousness of the crisis of fragmentation, the self-accelerating and potentially self-terminating frenzy that our whole society is bound up in, requires whole systems change. It's so profound. And that isn't something that any individual can be the hero of in the old masculine hero model. There needs to be a kind of heroism that we hold together as brothers and sisters and become, just like Dr. King or Gandhi or Nelson Mandela were, individuals around which a profound social change movement was able to organize itself, and their practice kind of buoyed a whole community. No individual is adequate. This is such a big transformation. For us to go from this extractive relationship to the planet to a genuinely, permanently sustainable presence on the planet is so radical. It's going to take a network of communities. I coined this term, a meta sangha, a sangha of sanghas. And the kind of leadership that's necessary is the kind of leadership that can be in relationship, and that's yin. I have to receive you. I have to. You're not going to find your way into an altruism where you'll make sacrifices for the greater good, and sometimes for my benefit, if I'm not taking in and respecting and receiving you. This mutual receptivity, which is a yin, characteristically yin quality, is going to be central to us coming together with a different kind of social glue and friendship. It's an evolution of friendship in a way. It's really all about the wisdom of the heart and a different level of love, a kind of love that can achieve authority, like I was saying a few minutes ago.
So let's backtrack then and go start from the start with the book in terms of the title, A New Republic of the Heart. What did you mean by that title?
It's a paradoxical title because it sounds, kind of utopian, really. And partly what I'm saying is this whole systems change is revolutionary. It's in evolution of anything, biological, cosmic, cultural evolution, so, political transformation or personal change, there are stages. Things organize themselves and have a kind of coherence, and then something new replaces it, and it has a different set of principles that organize it. It has a different structure. Well, it's a revolutionary change when you move from one to another. And we're at the end of the way we've organized ourselves. Human civilization has succeeded famously and amazingly, and there are all kinds of things to praise and appreciate and be grateful for, and it ain't working anymore. We've gotten our eviction notice. It's change or die. We're not going to be able to continue. So that's a revolutionary change, and that isn't just a social or political revolution. It's not like we fully even know all the aspects of this next stage that we're going to. And yet, the fragmentation, the crises of fragmentation that you can see everywhere in healthcare, in education, in human families, in the relations of men and women, in our food chain, everywhere we turn, there's a crisis. All these crises are happening, though, under circumstances in which we have more wealth and comfort and access to information and mobility and communications opportunity than we've ever had before. We're like the luckiest, richest people who've ever lived, but who are also glimpsing the fact that our very way of being is bringing forth, I'm fundamentally very optimistic and inspired and genuinely happy. But part of what we're all challenged to do is to drop into a level of being that is just so much deeper than we tend to live at. Almost all of human culture is a little bit half up out of the body, out of our seat. We're all enough traumatized that we're asserting something as a kind of compensation and a counter strategy. And so dropping in deeply enough to be real, truly brokenhearted and vulnerable, is the beginnings of us having an honest and real conversation about what our actual situation is. We're all parts of a society that's committed to denial, so deeply committed to denial. That means that I'm partaking of that denial, and you are. We can't help it. However much we may know, there's something that's tending to falsify and make our own relationship to reality in some ways superficial or inauthentic. For us to, we have to encounter our own fear and the trauma in our own bodies, and soften and deepen and show up at a whole different level. That's a revolutionary. That's yin heroism, isn't it? It's very yin, and yet on the other hand, it takes courage. It takes character. It's something I profoundly respect and aspire to, and hope others will recognize that the easy poses of acting like you're strong and being declarative are, comparatively speaking, cowardly. They're a cop-out. So it takes a greater heroism to be present to our reality and present to each other vulnerably. If our hearts aren't breaking, if we're not present, it's our grandkids, generations and beyond that are at stake. What could have more moral force than that? And for us to treat the whole thing as if it's just some mental puzzle that we need to figure out the solution to, that's not the paradigm out of which any of this is going to happen. We have to find our way to a much more profound relationship to our experience. It's a shamanic relationship, for sure. It's got many dimensions. It's not, but everybody who has a partial solution or a certain way of being virtuous or adequate, every perspective is both true and partial. So all of us have something to offer, but we also have our blind spots. And entering into relationships with one another with the appropriate humility is the beginning point of real sanity.
Yeah. Yeah, so I want to continue that thread and ask you more about denial, disconnect. But a question comes to my mind first, because you were writing this book, or it's been a 3-year or so journey to write this book. So that predates the election of Donald Trump. And since Trump's been elected, it's been a great awakening of resistance and energy, catharsis. But these problems don't just start. You started writing the book more, 3 years ago, as I said, predating Trump. So these problems of the eviction notice and denial are long-standing problems.
Right.
Right.
No, this is a systemic crisis of human civilization.
Coming to a head at this point
Exactly.
in time.
I think Barbara Marx Hubbard is the one who said, it may be that an intelligent species, a dexterous species that began to formulate technology and that on any planet would eventually succeed so much that it would exceed the planetary carrying capacity and begin to choke on its own wastes and come to the kind of crisis that we're facing now. It may just be inherent, and this crisis, although it might be self-terminating, is the opportunity to turn an apocal evolutionary corner. And so it's not primarily to be viewed negatively. It's an opportunity for the very greatness in each of us and the human species to show up and do something very different than anything we've ever done before. That's the larger situation. But unfortunately, we're seeing that the ability of human beings to come together and make their collective decisions with intelligence, let alone wisdom, is under severe threat. This, in a way, reverse engineering of the democratic system and of the openness of the internet and of Facebook by bad actors that delivered this election to Donald Trump is it's an expression of just how profoundly those of us who have developed the upper coil, the higher consciousness, the heart, and these higher principles need to become strong at the lower functions. Donald Trump may be morally deficient, but he is a genius at the level of the navel, the intelligence in the gut, the power, will function. And we tend not to be nearly so well developed there. But together and in a coherent way, we could be. And we've got to get beyond the traditional posture that's so pervasive on the left of speaking truth to power. It's very telling that we talk very, stirringly how much we admire people who have the cojones to speak truth to power. It would be nice if we had the cojones to find a way to acquire and wield power instead of, always kind of in this weak position of speaking truth to it. And I think that the writing is on the wall. From a systemic perspective, if we just distance ourselves and try to look objectively at the dynamics of what's happening on the planet, no intelligent species would go through a crisis like this without its best intelligence, its best wisdom, making an effort to grab hold of the tiller of the ship of state in order to take it to a safer, wiser place. And there are many different interpretations of what that wisdom is, but our highest wisdom must try. The adulthood of the human species, which is what this crisis calls for, has to find its way into being, and it will, and it is. In a way, this revolution is like a fractal, or it's almost like something best described like a hologram. In other words, there's a stage transition, a revolution of wholeness versus fragmentation going on in my heart, in your heart, in every relationship, in every family, in every organization, in every community, in every nation, every ethnic tribe, everyone is up against these crises of fragmentation that are ready to take us kind of down the tubes, kind of a suicidal direction. And yet there's this, wait a second, life wants to live and keep living. Evolution wants to keep evolving. The goodness and beauty of our being we want to turn this corner. What would it be like if the human species evolved for another 10,000, 100,000, million years? What kinds of glories could come? Isn't that inspiring to us? Don't we want to preserve that possibility? Don't we care enough for the future of biodiversity on this planet, for the lot of our descendants? What could have more moral force? What could inspire us more? And yet we have to face that if we project the current trends forward, there's no basis for hope. And many of the, one of the things that I had to go through to write this book was a series of dark night of the soul journeys. Because if you take a look at the trends, they're just completely, we are now tracking worse than the worst case projections of the International Panel on Climate Change that the UN convened. They had 3 scenarios, how things look like they're going, how they might go if we mitigate, and if we really blow it, there's our worst case. Well, we're worse than the worst case already, significantly. And there are many, many other data points. It may not even be climate change itself that is the biggest of our crises. There are so many different ways that we can look at this pattern and conclude that there's no hope. And unfortunately, we live in a society that's in complete denial. And so most people are afraid to even face that reality. Of those who have the courage and integrity to face it and feel it, almost all of them conclude that we're screwed and just try to orient toward the inevitable collapse of everything. I think it's very important that we recognize that the future genuinely is emergent. Yes, there are powerful trends. We have created a huge karmic IOU, and we're going to reap a whirlwind of extreme weather events, a variety of disruptions, and a future that doesn't include some pretty hair-raising and heartbreaking disasters is pretty hard to imagine. But the idea that we know that it's all just going down the tubes is, I think, we don't know enough to be that pessimistic, especially when we realize that our attitudes become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we enter into this with a sense of possibility, we can be the co-creators of whatever possibility we are afforded. And it may be that our biggest opportunities for fundamental redesign of our current systems and real change will come in the windows of opportunity that are opened up after some of these disasters. So the idea that we know it's all just going to hell in a handbasket, I think is ultimately, I really respect the people who have that opinion because they are among the people who have had the moral courage to face and go, the dark news and go through a dark night journey. But I think they need to complete that journey and come back to a not knowing, out of which they can be the intention of what's best in their hearts and actively be co-creating our best possible futures. That's so important.
Yeah. So you talk about wicked problems, black swan moments, and manufactured consent or consensual, just like consenting to what people see. So is it that these wicked problems are what people need to not let them be overcome by? You talk about the people who really, any of us who see what's going on, see the wicked problems, the big problems. So how do we get past there and back past manufacturing consent and going along with what authorities tell us and the tribe tells us to wholeness?
Well, there's no simple formula for any of this. You and I talked earlier about the fact that once we recognize that the mainstream narrative isn't necessarily fully accurate, we easily unravel all consensual truth, and we end up in this post-truth environment in which every conspiracy theory seems to be
right.
equally valid as information that we get through the proper practice of journalism or the proper practice of the scientific method. And our ability to think critically and reason from evidence and recognize the difference between valid and evidence and rumor and fake news and all the rest of it is currently under threat. And that's one of the ways in which we're in a terrific social crisis. So that needs to be addressed, and that's why I speak of it first. But setting that aside for a moment, we have to face the fact that nothing could be more disorienting than the idea that our world and civilization don't really have a legacy future. Because the meaning of your work, like creating all of these deep conversations and putting them out to the world, meaning of my work, writing my book, all these things are potentially ways that we can be of help into some human future. And you take that away, and all of a sudden our lives are stripped of these higher meanings. It can be so disheartening and so disorienting that our emotional reaction to that is really what we end up talking about. Very often the conversation about global warming particularly, or about any of the existential threats that the human race is facing, are abstracted into merely mental conversations like all this is an engineering problem, and can we reduce these emissions in this way, and and sometimes a political problem, but it's all identified as if it's an objective third-person quantity that we can analyze and figure out and strategize relative to. Whereas that's not an authentic way to talk about that topic. If we are really seriously admitting that we're in such a situation, that's so profoundly serious, so deep, that we have to break through and be existentially present, heart to heart. We're in some ways on the edge of tears, but then we have to break through and be on the edge of laughter too, because things are far too serious for us to lose our sense of humor. Some lightheartedness, some brightness of being has to find its way in too. All our strategies of compensating, embracing, and strategizing and positioning ourselves and trying to be, they don't work. We've got to admit that we can't predict the future. It's volatile, unpredictable, chaotic, and ambiguous. Those are military planning terms, VUCA. There will be black swans, completely unpredictable events that will take things in a whole new direction. And some of those will be positive black swans. We may have technological breakthroughs that will be game-changing. It's not necessarily inconceivable to me that there could be a technological breakthrough that could actually turn around some of these key issues relative to climate change. However, that will not be enough. Culture is going to have to change. We're going to have to be able to make decisions, collective decisions on behalf of the humans on this planet that are governed by wisdom, or we're going to be screwed no matter what technology offers us. So the sense that that some measure of responsibility devolves to every human individual is unescapable. This human species doesn't have what's called a dominant monad. That means there's no one person throwing the lever as to one intelligence, one decision-making body, not even a legislature, that's in charge of what happens for humanity as a whole. Some of that responsibility is distributed through millions of individuals, meaning that some of that responsibility is in that chair and this chair. And for us to wake up to actually participating in a way that recognizes that we have some measure of responsibility for at a time when the evolutionary future of life on the planet is in play, in which wonders and terrors are, this is a tipping point moment in our lifetimes. And your soul, my soul, somehow consented to be here now. This is our time. This is our opportunity. This is not bad news. If the measure of a human life is your opportunity to make a difference on a larger scale, we've hit the jackpot. We have all of these technological tools to communicate broadly. We have this amazing view in our lifetimes. The Hubble telescope has given us this vision of this incredibly vast universe and this billions of years evolutionary trajectory. And we're also seeing ahead that we may be bringing it to an end. I mean, wow, what an opportunity. We're in that sense, maybe the luckiest people who've ever lived. But with that comes this profoundly daunting moral challenge to become, to responsibly deploy this. And to me, this is facile. We can't talk about this in a facile way. It's a koan. It's an impossible question. And this impossible question changes, the Zen monk who is given a koan. This is like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or show me your original face, the one you had before your parents were born. It stops the mind, but it changes the consciousness of the practitioner, right? By stopping the mind, it changes your way of being. Well, how can you be the change that's going to turn around this whole crazy, self-terminating, mad, self-accelerating dance of human civilization? How can you be that? Well, it's an impossible question. But like Rilke so beautifully wrote to Franz Capus in one of his letters, these are questions you must live the questions. You must love the questions. So we're living in this impossible question. And I pose that question to my reader, but quite honestly, life poses that question to all of us. We're all stuck with that question, and it is going to change us. And it changes our relationships to each moment of our experience. It changes our relationships to each other. And it demands of us that we find within ourselves a capacity to be present to this incredibly heavy, what could be more heavy than all this? And somehow with lightheartedness, because we're not ever at our best without a kind of humor and a kind of spring in our step and sparkle in our eye. How can we be all of that in the face of this effectively?
Yeah, so I want to go back to Donald Trump again and ask a question in that regard, but not about him so much. But, we have a certain audience demographic that you talk to, I talk to, in terms of people who have that spark in their mind and just need that to be kindled. But what about the people who are broken and disconnected, fragmented, and feel left behind by the changes in society? And those are the people Donald Trump talked to and put the fire in their belly and got them to vote for him. But how can we talk to those people to make sure the people who are fragmented or good-hearted people who would also want to live in a republic of the heart and get them to get on the bus?
Well, I don't think there's any formula for that either. It's another facet of this existential, impossible question that we've all been asked by life. I think that the first thing is, in my experience, seeing the humanity of that person and being curious to meet them in the places where we can meet. And by treating them with respect, I elicit some measure of courtesy and respect in return. I think that it tends to be that the political talking points, the kind of things that are debated on cable news, are places where they're listening to Fox. They're, in a sense, their mind has been closed by a habit pattern that's been set in motion, such that those conversations are already rehearsed and there's not a lot of open space. So focusing on those issue-focused conversations often is pointless. However, you can find all kinds of values and experiences that you have in common, and you can build that. And I think reknitting the social fabric is the first thing that's always appropriate to do. Now, I think that you can also help them notice the moral depth and seriousness and care with which you are, in my case, I help them see that I'm someone that they can respect and that my orientation is based on deep care. And that will hopefully insert a little bit of a question mark in their mind and draw them a little bit out of the just being in the tank for this kind of closed narrative out of which, all we can hope to do is what we already see happening in the polls and kind of sap the enthusiasm of people like that when we talk with them and intensify our own commitment.
Yeah. In our own journey towards wholeness and reconciling our own heart, we can be an exemplar and inspirational role models of people wherever they are in the political spectrum who are broken and disconnected to aim for the higher truth of their own heart.
I think that's right. I think that there are a small number of people who are really motivated by the kind of team sports mentality, and they just want to kind of hate on the other team and reinforce the strength of their team. But that's a minority. I think the people who are persuadable are the sincere people who a lot of the Trump supporters are people who are very admirable. I mean, people who are starting their own businesses or who are police or fire or farmers, hardworking people, small business people who have a very strong work ethic and a strong ethic of reciprocity. If you really work hard and earn something, you ought to be rewarded, that we shouldn't have a culture of dependency. And there are reasons for being conservative. There's a valid tension between left and right, between communitarian and libertarian values, between order and freedom. There are a variety of polarities, and there's a future right and a future left that we're evolving toward that it will always be a dialectic. There's not going to be a final victory of the left over the right. We're going to have an evolution of these enduring tensions. And so having a fundamental respect for a two-sided political dynamic, I think, is really important. On the other hand, there are times when a truly integral sensibility, which is sometimes distinguished from an either-or thought, is kind of binary. And so we say, well, let's have a both-and orientation. And so I've kind of been articulating that. A lot of integral or evolutionary politics is about transpartisanship and about just really reknitting the social fabric. And I'm completely into that. Very enthusiastic supporter of living room conversations or civil conversations or the Institute for Civil Discourse. Those are really important initiatives. On the other hand, a truly both-and disposition is both either-or and both-and when appropriate. And we are in a time when, Donald Trump is embodying an awful lot of immoral, lying, cheating, bullying.
Pathological.
There's so much pathology there that I hope that it's going to unite a lot of people of good faith in a different level of discourse and commitment and practice, such that the 2018 and 2020 election cycles are going to be a gathering point where a lot of people who've been sitting out politics because, they don't like the level of discourse, they don't want to kind of get their hands dirty. A lot of the people involved in the inner work have pulled away from the outer work. And we signed an IOU. We said, these problems can't be solved with the kind of thinking that created them, so I'm going to change my consciousness. Okay, now's the time for you with your changed consciousness to solve those problems. And engagement is obliged upon us. It's a new moment. So I hope that we're going to see a very large scale engagement of spiritual practitioners and people who haven't voted, for instance. I think it's a moral responsibility to vote and engage. I think Trump makes that visible. And by being, in so many ways, an ugly, people on the left kind of love to hate him, and he makes himself pretty contemptible. I like to joke that he's the poster boy for all 10 of the 7 deadly sins. And I hope that that actually brings us together in a whole new way. I think that because the larger crisis on the planet is also at a tipping point, that the coincidence of this particular crisis can be a point of us rallying and coming together at a whole new level. I plan to be more engaged in this election cycle than I ever have been in the past.
That's great.
I hope everybody will be.
Yeah, and as we know, whatever happens to Donald Trump, whether he survives his 4 years, gets reelected, gets impeached, or somehow gets booted out or passes away, the problems, as we talked about earlier, the problems preceded him, and the wicked problems are not going away, whatever happens to Donald Trump. We may not have another person like him, but that's where it behooves us. And so you have a chapter in your book, Conversations That Matter, and I'd like to talk about that, because these are the conversations where people start bridging. You break it down to the 3 groups, the innovators, the ecologists, and the evolutionaries. So could you say a little bit about that in these conversations?
Well, I think that there are many important conversations that become possible and necessary at this point in time. The first one I talk about is the conversation between activists and awakeners, that people who've been involved in social justice or environmental movement in terms of outer political action have tended to be people with a different focus than people who've been focused on the inner work. Those groups of people are natural partners and need to be in dialogue with each other. Those conversations can knit a new coalition. That's important. There's other kinds of conversations among serious practitioner activists that just deepen our whole way of being, that open up a different level of what can sometimes be called we space. That there is Michael's experience, there's Terry's experience, and in the place where our eyes meet, somewhere here in the middle ground, there's the we. The we between us has its own qualities, and it itself can be cultivated and can become something quite delightful and conscious, and it can have its own kind of awakening. And I think that us deepening our whole way of being together is really important. At the end of the book, I talk about how there are a few places right now where human intelligence is in dialogue with itself at the edge of our moment of history about creating the future, about what kind of future we're going to have. And there are, unfortunately, just because, we have to have some agreements in order to have a decent conversation. And what tends to happen is that some of our agreements about what is intelligent or what is worth thinking about or what is valid and what is useful exclude other people. And we're at a point right now where our very best intelligence is in discourse in 3 bubbles that don't intersect enough. And I call one of those the innovators. And the innovators are people who really have the most power and influence right now. And they're the entrepreneurs and technologists who are actively creating a future. And it's mostly a future of technological innovation and possibility. They're optimistic, but they tend toward a kind of transhumanist vision. Elon Musk sometimes says, well, maybe it's too late for us to not totally screw up Earth. Let's make sure we have colonized Mars and other planets. I have some problems. I'm kind of attached to this planet. I'm not ready to give up on it. And I think that's a pretty important point. I really like oxygen and living plants and a blue sky. But the innovators, with their money and their power, are creating a future, and they are going to be a part of that of anyone's future. But there's another group of people with whom I usually have more sympathy that I call the ecologists, who have had the moral courage to look at the climate science, to see how all of human economy is a subset of the ecology of the living Earth, who are taking seriously the implications of all the ways that we've afflicted the health of this living earth, and who are thinking and in more than merely thinking, they're in conversation culturally and humanly about how to be a responsible living participant in this larger human and non-human community of living beings on this planet during this crisis moment. And they're largely facing the darkness, and there's not a single point of view that dominates the whole conversation, but I would say that many of them have the opinion that we have screwed things up too much for it to be remediable. They're more pessimistic. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that those innovators need to talk to those ecologists and hear from them. They need to listen. But I think that the ecologists need to listen to the innovators too, because the future is going to be shaped by both of these conversations. Now, there's a third group that I'd include us in that I call evolutionaries. And the evolutionaries are the people who recognize that consciousness evolves. And so we are able to not only see things, but to look at the way we see things and the structures of our meaning making, so that we awaken from one frame of meaning and we can make our subjectivity, the lens through which we're seeing things, an object of our inspection. And therefore, we're able to think in a synthetic way that can appreciate the truths, even though they might be partial, of everybody who's participating in a lot of different conversations. So I think we have a responsibility to convene conversations between innovators and ecologists and ourselves. And what we would bring to that conversation, I would say, is a perspective of a higher consciousness, of the evolution of consciousness, of a spiritual inspiration. Mm-hmm. Because in a way, the unreasonable trust in life, in the infinite depth of this moment, this constantly disappearing and reappearing now that is our constant home and companion, that sense of wonder and that in love disposition is a foundation for something that doesn't come into the conversation if it only includes the innovators and the ecologists. And we need to presence that in some of these conversations as well. I think that there are many, many conversations going on. I focus on those three because in each of them, there is an honest and deep conversation happening about the human future that is breaking new ground and is going to create our future. The best intelligence of human beings in discourse is what is, like a lightning rod, kind of attracting the electricity from the troposphere. There's new awareness coming into the human collective in each of these conversations. And they tend to be hermetically sealed. Their inability to learn from one another is potentially, our ability to meet the mark, to meet the challenge of our time, depends on all our best intelligence, our best mental intelligence, our best heart intelligence, our best gut intelligence, all being in discourse. And that is only going to happen if all of the places where our best intelligence is engaged are informed by one another. And right now they're not. The innovators look at us evolutionaries as if we're soft-headed New Age idealists. They look at the ecologists as if they're just pessimistic Luddites. The ecologists feel morally superior to the innovators because they're the authors of all kinds of the destruction of the natural world. They look at the evolutionaries as if they're impractical and too focused on their inner lives. The evolutionaries feel we have a higher consciousness, so we're more evolved, and so we have a kind of obnoxiousness. Everybody's got to get off it and have a kind of deep humility and really get that we need each other and that there's real intelligence going on in those
yeah.
other conversations.
Yeah, I think it was the hubris of the innovators and their omnipotence in creating the social network that has now been used to destroy the social fabric. But that it's an important. It was a great chapter, and it was really important to see how we can bring these threads together.
Yeah. Yeah, the book, the book starts deep and goes deeper. And I think it ends up being a genuinely practical guidebook to how we can really engage in a way that brings forth the brightness of our hearts and the love that we want to be in a meaningful and hands-on, engaged way. And I haven't, this is the book I really wanted to read, so I had to write it.
Yeah, no, it's great. You did, and you have the whole chapter on evolutionary activism that talks about in the system, against the system, around the system, the different ways people can engage. Yeah. And my favorite part of that was around the system, and you gave specific examples. And I was most captivated by, I mean, they were all great examples, but the Cosmos Co-op and the Scenius and the scenes of genius that is being attempted to be created.
Yeah.
Because I personally feel that's really the hope of the future, these gatherings of the collective intelligence and what can bubble up, what can emerge, that unknown that can happen, and what that can spring forth.
Absolutely so.
Yeah.
We have to take seriously that our humble little initiatives that just involve regular human beings like us, take a mugshot of yourself exactly as you are. These are the people who are going to have to turn this thing around. We can't wait for some more evolved race of beings to come into existence. It's going to have to be us, just as we are, with all our laziness and confusion and neurosis and all of the limitations that we have. We're going to have to find what's best in ourselves, show up in it as it, forgive and love each other as we are, and join together and create the greatest moral and creative greatness that that we are capable of, and that we're mutually capable of.
And as you talk about too, and I'm extrapolating a little bit, but evolutionary activism occurs right in a person's daily life, how they are in their relationships, how they are in their work, how they show up in their lifestyle and diet, and how that impacts everything they do.
Yes. And one of the things that I think is people don't generally take all the way in is that, yes, our regular lives are an expression of our whole way of being. And that way of being can evolve and can change, and it's important that it do. And some forms of our activism are just making a change to our diet, or some forms of our activism are starting a business, or some parts of our activism have to do with just the random acts of kindness that we bring forward in our relations, in our family, and in our community. But these times will bring out both the best and the worst in all people. And at a time when the worst is being brought out in some people, the more of us who find a way to bring out what is best in us, so that we really show up and practicing showing up. A life of practice in which we recognize, neurons that fire together wire together. And so whatever way we are living, we're going to be more like that in future moments. And so the tendency to feel hopeless and depressed needs to be resisted. We actually have a different possibility. And I think it's paradoxical because, if all we were doing was choosing between hope and despair, we'd just choose hope and that would be it. But we're dealing with a kind of flimsy, denial-based hopefulness, a darkness that most people are afraid to face and feel fully. And on the other side of that dark night of the soul, there's a different kind of positive intentionality, that's full of hope and possibility, that's robust enough to really be built for the times. And going through the fire of our own transformation such that we become a presence with the kind of gravitas and lightheartedness that's necessary. That's something that we can be doing right here, right now, that we can help each other as friends find our way into.
Yeah, yeah. So if someone reads the book and says, I'm ready to join this revolution, where do they go from there?
Well, I hope that they will join a new Republic of the Heart. We're just in the process now of getting all the last of the paperwork and then everything together. There'll be an opportunity to come onto our website and become a member, a participant in this conversation in these terms.
What website would that be?
A newrepublicoftheheart.com will get you there. myname.com, terrypatten.com will get you there. And there will, in time, be a whole community engagement dimension, and we hope that people will want to participate in a variety of ways and be empowered in their own activism. That, in some sense, what we offer that's unique, I think, is a comprehensiveness of view that can be a resource to people who already have other communities where they are engaging social entrepreneurship or other forms of activism or deep spiritual work or community building or eco-village build. There are a whole variety of worthy initiatives. In fact, the last section of the book is a resource section that really just scratches the surface of this enormous new Republic of the Heart that's coming into being. And this term, a new Republic of the Heart, is a description of something that I think is already happening. Since it's revolutionary and it's fractal, so the revolution's happening in everybody's heart, this new Republic of the Heart is kind of coming into being naturally and inherently. I use the metaphor of the mycelium, the root system of fungi, of mushrooms. And it is just this kind of filament-like structure. It can look almost like a snail trail. It's very thin and insubstantial, but it can extend for vast, miles and miles, actually. The one that was documented that 30 miles across in Oregon. And it's a single creature, but, or not creature, but life form, that has, little bits of mushroom blooming here, there, and everywhere where the conditions are ripe. So it can just lay dormant for long periods of time. That's a neat thing about the mycelium. And it can draw water where there's plenty of water, where it's dry. It can draw minerals from where there's plenty to where there's more needed. It has a symbiosis with photosynthetic plants, and that's actually what creates actual soil. It's amazingly generative at a time when there's increasingly a topsoil crisis coming. It's another dimension of its significance. And this mycelium has some similarities to something socially. Like there's already a kind of goodness in the hearts of most people. There's 1/2% to 2% of people are sociopathic and incapable of empathy and potentially evil. But 98 to 99.5% of people are fundamentally good. And between all of us reasonably good people, there's all kinds of things that are very healthy. We give each other the best directions, even if we're strangers. We are courtesy. There's some courtesy that we show to strangers in a whole variety of ways. There's a kind of goodness. There's so many things that are right already in our human relations. And that is, by its nature, a response. We're in this crisis of fragmentation, and that is an expression of wholeness. Everything that's coherent and healthy and that has integrity is a kind of counterforce to everything that's falling apart and fragmented and corrupt. And so this social mycelium is already this. I'm calling my book A New Republic of the Heart, and in a sense, yes, I'm calling people to a positive vision. But in another sense, I'm like a social commentator who's just observing this is just happening by itself. already. You're an expression of it. Your work is an expression of it. And yet everybody's way of expressing it, however true, is also partial. We all also need to be in school, learning to become an even more comprehensive or integrated expression of this wholeness. Because we're in a moment of a radical crisis of fragmentation. And that crisis of fragmentation is existential. So I hope that we as individuals can have a little bit of a come to Jesus moment in which we really get how much responsibility is with us, and that can elicit from us not a heavy kind of guilty, dark kind of energy, but a bright and genuinely generous and inspired.
Yeah, a return to wholeness.
Exactly.
Yeah, and as you end the book, you say it's time.
Yeah.
Why not? Why, if not now, then when?
Yeah.
And I think the time is ripe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is. I
Yeah.
think people sense it. It's a
Yeah, yeah.
revolutionary time.
Yeah. So thank you so much for writing the book, Terry, for putting your heart and soul and every essence of your being into it. And I think it's going to really spark that which has already been sparked, but bring it even further in so many ways.
Thank you so much, Michael.
yeah.
Thank you so much for having me
Yeah,
for this
so-
interview.